Hey everybody, we're going to talk about chapter 2, Sociology, Culture, and we'll get into this. So take down the title card if you haven't. Let's move on to the first slide. So first, what is culture? Culture is kind of a group of people that share certain things that are passed down from generation to generation. Language, beliefs, what your norms are in a society, behaviors, things that are appropriate, that aren't appropriate, that make sense. And so there are kind of two different types of cultures. There is material culture, which is things, things like jewelry and art and buildings and weapons and machines and utensils and hairstyles, clothing, all these things, right? That's part of our culture. And then we also have non-material culture. It's kind of the opposite, right? It is the symbolic culture, as you will. It's a way of thinking. It's what your beliefs are. It's what is appropriate to do, what's not appropriate to do. What are some of those symbolic interactionism pieces? How do you interact with people? When is it appropriate? When is it not? What is the function of things? So, a culture in North Africa is going to be very different than a culture in the United States, and they're going to have different material cultures and different non-material cultures, and that's to be expected. Now, when people get introduced to a new culture, it can be very shocking, right? It's called culture shock when things are happening that don't make sense to you because your culture, your norms, and where you live are very different from someone else's. So if you travel to a place with a very different culture, you don't know it, that could be a big problem. And so, one of the things to try to not to do is have ethnocentrism, which is using your own culture as kind of a judgment of others, right? Say, well, my culture does this, and this other culture does this, so they're worse. One example of that is like food, right? In the United States, there are a lot of things that we don't eat that we think are like bad or disgusting or inappropriate to eat, right? Things from ants or rats or monkey brains, camel liver, things like that. That in different parts of the world, and Laos, eating rats is common. If you go to the Sudan, raw camel liver is a delicacy. So there are certain parts of the world where things are different, and we might look down on another culture, but they might look down on us for something that we do, right? So I think you have to understand those differences in and of itself. Something that are key with culture is that it's not natural. Culture has been created, it's been passed down. Most of these cultures have aspects that have been there for centuries, maybe millennia, and so that's why it can be very difficult to change. Culture infuses kind of the values in people's decision making. So people might have different values on what is appropriate and what is not, based on their culture, and that can have an influence. But there is some culture that's universal. There are some things, generally like murder being wrong is generally accepted across all culture. So that's which makes sense. Let's go on to the next slide. So understanding culture, kind of the goal is to apply cultural relativism when there are problems or issues, right? And that means just not making those judgments, right? So something like bullfighting, might be something that you wouldn't necessarily do in the United States. But in Spain, it's fairly common activity, right? And hurting a bull, you might say, oh, that's wrong, that's bad, but it's different culturally. And, cultures can change too. Some things that were accepted before, like in the U.S., things like cockfighting or, dog fighting. Those are things today that we say are unacceptable, right? So cultures can adapt. They can change over time. That non-material culture, symbolic culture, they're both the same thing, same name, uses symbols to get things across. Language is a big one. Language is just symbols, so we'll focus on language a bit. But gestures, that different gestures mean different things in different cultures. Something that means good, like a thumbs up in the United States, means "fu" in Iran. So these symbols can be different depending on culture. So language itself is influenced by it kind of builds this sociological past and has influence on the future. We'll get into that a little bit in the next slide here as well. So one of the interesting things with language, right, is the question of like language allows us in a culture to kind of share experiences. And it's not that everyone has to speak the same language, right? But oftentimes language and communication is created out of experience. So like if you just accept one language and that's all that we have in a culture, society, then you're going to lack diversity. But if there could be kind of a learned, joint language, which happens in a lot of places with a lot of diversity, that can make a lot of sense. That can help different diverse groups, be in one culture and try to achieve certain things together. One of the interesting hypotheses about language in cultures is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And what they hypothesized was that language actually dictates the way you think more than the way you think creates language. So, for example, we have like, for us here in America, the term nut in reference to like a peanut or an almond or a walnut, right? That we kind of lump all of those things into the same group. We think of like walnuts and pecans and peanuts and almonds, all this kind of the same kind of thing. Spanish doesn't have that word. And so those foods are very separate. They're not the same thing. They're all very different in their minds. That's how language can affect it. So let's another example that's kind of interesting. In Hebrew, jam and jelly are the same thing. They're not any different, right? Whereas like in the United States, jam and jelly are we have two words, so there must be a difference. And if you basically put quote unquote jam and jelly in front of an English speaker, they'll pick out, they'll say there's a difference, and in front of a Hebrew, only Hebrew speaker, they won't. So maybe that's how language can influence how you think. So some interesting experimentation with that. So how you kind of regulate in a culture. A culture has certain values, things that are desirable in people's lives, and certain norms are kind of the expectations of behavior. And if you break those expectations, then you get some kind of sanction, right? You get a positive sanction if you follow the norms, negative sanction if you break the norms, right? So, a negative sanction can be material. We might have a norm about, certain laws that we have. We might get fined for certain things for being, disrupting the peace, things like that, being loud, a noise violation. Those might be norms that we have in our society. If you break that, it could be a negative sanction. Positive sanction might be things that you get a prize, you get a trophy. We have contests to see who can do this thing the best. That could be a norm. Now, a lot of times societies will have these kind of the cultures will have kind of these norm breaks where something like Mardi Gras, right, where it's like, okay, there's certain things you're not allowed to do in public, public drunkenness or flashing people, but hey, Mardi Gras, it's fine. So that might be a piece. So St. Patrick's Day might be one of those pieces of like, well, now you can kind of do whatever and it's okay. We have these kind of holidays set up so you can drink and maybe do things that are outside the norms, and you're not going to be judged as harshly for those things. Let's go on to the next slide here. Sub so there's some norms that are not really enforced. They're called folkways, and so there, it might be things like it's very small things. If we kind of have this norm in our society that people walk on the right side of the sidewalk, if someone's not doing that, you're not gonna start a fist fight with them, right? You might look at them weird, but if they're bopping around, walking too slow, walking too fast, things like that. And then we have norms that are more serious. They're called mores. The word looks like Moors, but it's mores. That generally we have to take people out of our society, out of our culture if they break. Killing, murder, rape, stealing things. These are things we hold very important, and things that are really big violations, that are heavily ingrained might be taboo. So like cannibalism would be a taboo, something that's very taboo in American culture, and in most cultures that would be the case. And then, kind of broken down from that a little bit is something like subcultures, right? That kind of within our culture, we have these subcultures that are formed. And, in the United States, there are thousands and thousands of subcultures. The internet has its own subculture, has its own language, that if you're really ingrained in that, you say things like PogChamp, you're in this internet subculture, right? Something that if you said it to your grandparents, they have no idea what you're talking about. That's a subculture. Your occupation might have a subculture. There might be certain things that are accepted if you're a politician and talking with other politicians, or, as a teacher, there's a teaching kind of subculture, things that are understood, things that are more universal, language that's used, that makes that kind of work. So it can be broken down by ethnic groups. It can be broken down by language. It can be broken down by religion. It can be broken down by music, different styles of music, different fans of TV shows, fans of bands. These are subcultures that exist. And so, there's a lot that breakdown. Might be something we talk about in more detail and look at some of these subcultures. Maybe even you talk about some that You also can have a counterculture, which is a culture that kind of breaks away from the norm and basically rejects the norm of the main culture. So, the biggest example for those of you who took, modern American or U.S. history last year is, the hippies during the Vietnam War, the counterculture of, of those people, right? Of the kind of pro-war, straight-laced, like this is where you kind of got this counterculture. Say like back in the 1800s, the Mormons were a counterculture that didn't believe in monogamy, and that was what was accepted in the United States. So it could be one specific issue, it could be a lot of issues, or an overarching issue like war, drugs, or things like that can be the case. Let's go on to the next slide here. So in the United States is a pluralistic society, right? We have a lot of different groups, and there's a lot of religious groups, there's a lot of racial ethnic groups. There's a lot of people that have diverse interests. Some people like to hunt. Some people like to collect Pokemon cards. Some people like to play video games. Some people, like to read. And so with this diversity, it's like, what is something that, what are things that kind of exist within every group? How do we kind of break this down? And so I've listed out the 13 that have been identified here. And I apologize for my double three for the third one. But achievement and success, right? And this applies to the United States, that Americans praise personal achievement, right? Kind of doing better than other people. It's not something that every culture in the world does, but seems to be very American in nature. Individualism, that you're different, unique, that kind of thing. Hard work, right? Working hard will get you success. Efficiency and practicality, so that you that you make the best use of your time. Doing things quickly, that's important in American culture. Science and technology, that if you can use the technology to make things easier, faster, better, you should do it. Material comfort, we like to be comfortable, and so having things that are nice, having a cell phone, that's material comfort. Freedom, right? This kind of core of quote unquote freedom, and being able to do what we want, in is generally an American feeling. Democracy, right? This majority rule is something that Americans in any culture within the U.S. kind of hold dear. Quality, that people are equal within groups. 10 is group superiority. So that even though this is kind of against freedom, kind of against democracy and equality, right? But that we regard some groups higher than others. We've seen that in terms of American history of denying women the right to vote, and slavery, and slaughter of Native Americans, right? This group superiority piece. So sometimes some of these might be in conflict with each other, and that's something we'll talk about further in the course. So you may have heard might be hearing some of these, be like, I don't know if that's quite true. We'll hit on that later in this chapter. Education, that what's an adequate education, that higher education should be pushed. Religiosity, not that you have to be religious, but that there is kind of a push in America to believe in something religiously, spiritually, like maybe that's going away a little bit, but that still could be the case. And then romantic love, marriage, monogamy. A lot of our kind of culture is based on that. So we'll dig into some of these further. Like I said, some of them you might have heard and be like, I don't know if that's wholly true. And so we'll kind of get to that. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Kind of emerging values. We can find kind of value clusters that, so some of these values that we just talked about, linked with each other, right? Something like hard work, education, material comfort, individualism, slash freedom, that these kind of work together, right? So, America basically supposed people go to school, work hard, get comfortable, and you'll have success and do what you like to do. Does it always happen? No, probably doesn't usually happen, but that's the quote unquote American dream, right? So that's the value cluster. It's the value cluster that works together. We also have value contradictions, right? And I hit on that a little bit, but you can't have group superiority and freedom and equality. Those don't jive with each other. You can't have racism and sexism and say, well, we're about freedom, we're about democracy, we're about equality. That doesn't work either. So over time, those type of contradictions will, rise up. And if those contradictions are, very far apart, then you can have a culture war. These cultures clash. Maybe politically, it's something that's kind of happening now, where you have the two sides of the political aisle really getting further apart, and there kind of becomes this cultural war that happens, or will happen with that. And new values emerge over time. So things that have emerged here, like leisure, being able to relax, as they're, and there's a lot invested in that. Self-fulfillment, that you should try to be kind of self-actualized, hit your full potential. Physical fitness, that you should be fit. It's not something that's new, but dieting and all these different types of exercise equipment, and pushing that, with a large majority of Americans being obese, that could be part of it too. And youthfulness, right? People don't want to age. Aging is normal, but we still feel like being youthful or looking youthful is important. And then even the concern for the environment, something that's emerged over, the past century or so in America. So let's go on to the next slide. So let's talk about kind of real culture. Cultures have kind of an ideal right? But a lot of times we don't fulfill it. Like, a culture tells you who you should be, but most of the time we can't be that. You know, in America, we say you should have a good education and work hard and have a bunch of material things. And if you don't have that, you're not working hard enough. That's probably not true. So this is kind of this. There's this ideal culture, and then we have the real culture of what really is happening. And there are really no universals that hit every culture. We might think there are some, right? And there are some things that are common, marriage and funerals and games and music, things like that. They're present, but the customs differ, right? How you train a child to use the toilet is different in America than the Sudan, than Japan. It's all very different. Even things that we would consider taboo might not be taboo elsewhere. I think something like incest is something where there are some areas where incest is even more taboo, right? Like in New Guinea, any a very, very distant relative, you have to track that and can't marry those people. We don't track in the U.S. as far as New Guinea does in terms of incestuous relationships and marriage. And you look back at the European royalty, and that was encouraged to keep royal blood within royalty, right? So there's a lot of things we might think, oh, that's probably bad, quote unquote, everywhere, but can be very different as well. So, and these ideas of kind of sociobiology can have an impact too. It can be a big negative, right? Sociobiology is basically that, hey, there's some biological factors that make people better than others. This is how we get things like the social Darwinism, get things like the Nazis, get things like racism, sexism, things like that. So I think that's important as well. All right, let's go on to the next slide, the last one, and technology and culture. Technology can set kind of a framework for non-material culture. Even though we consider technology to be very material in nature, but it allows you to do things differently than you have in the past, right? So if a group's technology changes, then the way people think about each other, relate to each other, changes over time as well. So I think that's important. So like take even like gender relations, right? In the world, there was this heavy gender inequality that existed everywhere, right? Men dominating women, and there's still parts of the world, maybe like the Middle East, where that happens. But as Western television and email and the internet, goes to these places, now we start to see a pushback against that gender inequality. So as there's more technology, more knowledge, that can change over time. Now, generally, there's some type of lag. The material culture will change first, then the non-material culture will lag behind. When you're sick, you probably now Google your symptoms, and sometimes the results can be very, very bad, right? But there probably are some areas where that's as good as going to the doctor to figure out to get a diagnosis. I even think of it like today, right? So not to use health as another example, or maybe even education. Give me an example, right? Of do you always have to go to the doctor's office? Can you do a televisit and get for a checkup, and will it be the same? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. Maybe not. Maybe it's a question for you, I guess. Is learning online from home, is it the same as being in class? We might say no. We might say, yeah, maybe there are ways that we could adapt or be better at this and use that technology in a way. So that's the key. We haven't necessarily maybe met some of these things with culture. Maybe in education, it can even be what we teach, right? Teaching things that you can just Google might, you can Google now might have been important 100 years ago, might not be important now. So that could be something that makes sense there. And globalization leads to cultures adopting things, especially with the rise of the internet, telephone, mass communication. Pieces of culture are all over the place. McDonald's is everywhere in the world now. It's a part of every culture. I don't say every culture, but it's part of a lot of cultures. They're in Japan, they're in Russia, they're in China, right? So even like these symbols of like Nike, sociologists have gone to isolated villages in India and found a Nike shirt. Like these things go across. So you have pieces of Japanese culture and anime and manga and things that now are pretty universal across the world in terms of entertainment, right? So globalization can lead to some of this adaptation of culture as well. So there's kind of a cultural piece, another kind of broad topic, but an important one as we move forward. So hopefully that was good, and I will talk to you soon.